The real story. Horror. Only. At Mr. Scare.
The story of the Christmas bell was one my grandmother told me every Christmas Eve by the flickering firelight. Her voice, steady and deliberate, carried a weight that seemed to hush the room, as though even the shadows dared not interrupt her.
There is a bell,
She said, her eyes serious as they caught the firelight.
that rings deep in the forest of Pinewood Hollow on Christmas Eve. Few hear it, but those who do, those foolish enough to follow its call, are never seen again.
As a child, I listened with a mix of fascination and fear, my imagination painting vivid images of a ghostly bell ringing in an endless, snow-covered forest. I pictured brave wanderers lured by its melodic call, only to vanish into the icy shadows. The story my grandmother told goes like this. It was December 24th, and snow lay thick over everything, turning the world into a white, frozen canvas. At 27, he was used to the city's bustling energy, but that night he embarked on a quieter journey to visit his grandmother in Pinewood Hollow. Nestled deep in a pine forest nearly 200 kilometers away, the village was a place of old-world charm and whispered legends. He left early, hoping to arrive before the snowfall worsened. As the hours passed, the familiar glow of city lights gave way to a twilight that seemed to stretch endlessly. The towering pines lining the road loomed darker as the day faded, their branches heavy with snow. The car radio played soft Christmas tunes, but his focus was on the road. Stories he'd once heard about Pinewood Hollow surfaced in his thoughts, tales of hauntings and eerie disappearances. Shaking off the unease, he muttered. As night descended, the snowfall intensified and visibility dropped to near zero. His windshield wipers struggled against the ice, forcing him to pull over. Stepping out to clear the glass, he noticed a figure standing motionless in the middle of the road.
Who would be out here in this weather?
He thought, narrowing his eyes as he switched on the high beams. The light revealed an old man with a long white beard, his faded red cloak dusted with snow. Lowering the window, he called out,
Sir, are you lost? It's freezing out here.
The man turned slowly, his hollow eyes glinting faintly under the headlights. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly.
I need to get to Pinewood Hollow. Can you take me?
Despite a growing sense of unease, he couldn't leave the man there in the cold. Forcing a smile, he nodded.
All right, get in.
As the old man settled into the back seat, an icy chill filled the car, one that even the heater couldn't dispel. Trying to ease the tension, he asked,
Do you live in Pinewood Hollow?
The man remained silent for a moment before replying,
I've been there a long time. So long, no one remembers me anymore.
His cryptic words sent a shiver down the driver's spine. Hoping to change the subject, he said,
It's Christmas. Why are you out here alone?
The man chuckled, a dry, unsettling sound.
Christmas is special this year,
He said.
There's something I must do.
As the lights of Pinewood Hollow finally came into view, he glanced in the rearview mirror to let his passenger know they had arrived, but the back seat was empty. Shocked, he slammed on the brakes and switched on the cabin light. The seat was undisturbed, as though no one had ever been there. His breath fogged the cold air as he stepped out, scanning the road for any sign of the man. Then he heard it, a bell tolling from deep within the forest. The sound was sharp, haunting, and oddly melodic, resonating in the cold stillness of the night. A faint light drew his attention to a nearby house. An old woman stood in the doorway, her face pale and anxious.
Young man,
She called, her voice trembling.
come inside. You shouldn't be out here.
What's that sound? The bell?
He asked, his voice unsteady. She hesitated before replying.
It's a warning. Every Christmas Eve the bell rings, and those who follow it don't come back the same.
Ignoring her plea, he followed the sound into the forest. Each step muffled by snow, he felt a strange pull drawing him deeper into the woods. Eventually, the bell led him to a crumbling chapel. Its ivy-covered walls were barely visible in the dim moonlight. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was dense, pressing against his chest. Rows of broken pews lined the room, and a single candle burned on the altar, casting shadows that seemed alive. In the center of the room, figures knelt in silent prayer.
Excuse me?
He called out, relief washing over him at the sight of others. But as the figures turned, his stomach dropped. Their faces were smooth, featureless, like mannequins brought to life. The bell tolled again, louder and sharper. At the altar stood the old man, his once solemn expression now twisted into something unrecognizable.
Welcome,
He said, his voice eerily calm.
to my Christmas service.
The faceless figures rose, their movements stiff and unnatural. Shadows stretched across the walls, creeping closer with every toll of the bell. In desperation, the young man grabbed a splintered piece of wood and swung at the bell. It cracked with a deafening sound, and for a moment everything froze. The shadows receded, the figures flickered, and the old man's expression softened. But as the young man turned to leave, the bell tolled once more. The pull of the forest and the chapel lingered, refusing to release him entirely. Days later, his car was found abandoned near Pinewood Hollow. Locals whispered about the Christmas bell, a tale of those who followed its call and were forever changed. They say its faint toll can still be heard on cold, silent nights. And those who hear it know one thing for certain: some paths are better left untrodden. Last Christmas, my girlfriend Emily invited me to celebrate the holiday with her family at their ancestral mansion deep in the snowy woods of Maine. We'd been dating for 6 months, and I felt this was a sign of how serious our relationship had become. Emily described her family as traditional but warm-hearted, and I was looking forward to a cozy holiday. The journey there was long and eerie. Snow blanketed the narrow road leading to her family's estate, the woods growing darker and denser as we approached. By the time we arrived, night had fallen. The mansion loomed before us, grand and gothic, with ivy-covered walls and glowing windows that seemed to watch us like eyes. Emily's family was waiting at the entrance. Her father, tall and gaunt, shook my hand with a grip that lingered uncomfortably. Her mother, a petite woman with sharp features, embraced me tightly, whispering,
"We're so glad you could join us."
Their warmth felt rehearsed. Inside, the mansion was breathtaking but strange. The walls were adorned with antique paintings of stern-faced ancestors, their gazes following me as I walked through the halls. A grand Christmas tree stood in the living room, its ornaments old-fashioned and slightly tarnished, as if they'd been there for generations. Emily's younger sister, Grace, was the last to greet me. She was about 16, with long, dark hair and pale skin that seemed almost translucent. She barely spoke, offering only a faint smile before retreating to the shadows of the room. Dinner was lavish, but unsettling. The family spoke in soft voices, often cutting their sentences short and glancing at each other. Emily seemed relaxed, laughing and chatting, but I felt like an outsider. When I asked about the mansion's history, her father said,
"Oh, it's been in the family for centuries. Every corner of this house holds memories."
His words felt heavy, like a warning. After dinner, Emily showed me to the guest room. It was large and cold, with a 4-poster bed and a massive window overlooking the snowy woods. I could see my breath as I unpacked, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Emily left me to settle in, saying she'd join me later after helping her mom with some chores. As I sat on the bed, a faint sound reached my ears, a distant hum, like a choir singing in unison. At first I thought it was my imagination, but as I strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. The voices were melodic yet chilling, like a Christmas carol sung in a minor key. Curious, I left the room and followed the sound down the hall. It seemed to come from the direction of the attic. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The closer I got to the attic door, the louder the singing became. Just as I reached for the doorknob, Emily's father appeared behind me.
"That part of the house is off limits.
He said, his voice stern but calm.
The structure is unstable. We wouldn't want you to get hurt."
I muttered an apology and returned to the guest room. but the singing stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. That night, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside my door. The mansion was silent except for the creaking of floorboards. I opened the door to find Grace standing in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes wide.
"They're waiting for you,"
she whispered, before darting away into the shadows. My heart raced as I stepped into the hallway, unsure of what to do. The singing had returned, louder and more distinct, as if it was coming from within the walls. Drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, I followed the sound again, this time leading me down to the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out from the cracks. I hesitated, but a voice in my head urged me forward. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the cold, damp air. At the bottom, I found the entire family standing in a circle, holding candles. In the center of the room was a large stone altar covered in strange symbols carved into its surface. Emily was there too, her back to me, her candle flickering in the dim light. "Emily?" I called out, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, her face serene but her eyes distant.
"You weren't supposed to come down here,"
she said softly. The singing grew louder and I realized it wasn't coming from the family. It was coming from somewhere else, as if the walls themselves were alive with voices. The symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the haunting melody. "What is this?" I demanded, stepping back toward the stairs. Emily's father spoke.
Every Christmas, we honor the spirits of our ancestors. They demand a gift, and in return, they protect our family.
My blood ran cold. "A gift?" Emily's mother stepped forward, her expression sorrowful.
We thought you'd understand. You're the perfect choice, young, strong, and an outsider. No one will miss you.
I turned and bolted up the stairs, their voices calling after me. The mansion seemed alive, the walls shifting as I ran through the halls. The singing followed me, growing louder and more discordant, as if the spirits were chasing me. I burst out into the snowy night, my breath visible in the freezing air. Behind me, the mansion's windows glowed faintly, the shadows of the family watching as I sprinted to my car. I drove for hours without stopping, my mind racing with what I had seen. When I finally reached a gas station, I checked my phone. There was a single text from Emily.
"We will see you next Christmas."
I've never returned to Maine, and I've never celebrated Christmas the same way since. But every year, as the holiday approaches, I hear faint singing in my dreams, a haunting reminder of the silent choir of Christmas. December 23rd, a day meant for holiday cheer, became the start of an unforgettable memory. My friends, Quinn, Lana, Tony, and I decided to spend Christmas at an old mansion hidden deep in the Vermont woods. The mansion, a legacy of Quinn's family, had been abandoned for decades after a mysterious fire in 1985.
"This is going to be amazing."
Quinn said, brushing off the local legends.
"Just ghost stories to keep people from trespassing."
But the stories were woven into the fabric of the town. Tales of a candle that mysteriously lit itself every Christmas Eve, glowing brighter than any ordinary flame, untouched by time or wind. We loaded Quinn's truck with supplies, excited for the adventure. The road narrowed as we approached, snow-laden trees encasing us in an eerie tunnel. When we arrived, the mansion loomed ahead, its grandeur dimmed, but still undeniable. Its broken windows seemed to watch us, and the silence of the surrounding forest felt almost unnatural.
"It's just an old house,"
Quinn said, though her voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. Yet, the place felt different, like it carried a memory waiting to be remembered. At first, the mansion was uneventful, even welcoming in its own way. We lit a fire, swept away the cobwebs, and filled its empty halls with laughter. For a moment, the shadows seemed to recede. As the evening unfolded, Lana's cheer faded. While preparing dinner, she froze, knife in hand.
"Did you hear that?"
she whispered.
Hear what?
Tony replied, his uneasy glance darting to the stairs.
"Footsteps.
She said.
Upstairs."
Quinn laughed nervously.
"This place creaks like crazy. It's just the house settling."
But we weren't convinced. After dinner, we stayed in the living room, playing cards by the fire, yet the feeling of being watched lingered. At one point, Lana glanced upward.
The sound, it's coming from the study, isn't it?
She said softly. Quinn's expression darkened.
That room has been locked since the fire. No one's been in there.
Curiosity got the better of us. Flashlights in hand, we ventured upstairs. At the end of the hallway stood the door to the study, its surface worn but still imposing.
There's no way it's open.
Quinn said, yet as she reached for the handle, it creaked open, as if inviting us inside. The room was immaculate, untouched by dust or decay. At its center, on an ornate desk, sat a single candle. Its flame burned with an unnatural brightness, casting sharp, dancing shadows across the walls.
No one's been here,
Tony murmured.
How is it lit?
Lana moved toward the candle but hesitated. She stepped back abruptly, as though an unseen barrier had stopped her. The air grew colder, the flame flickering in a way that seemed alive. We shouldn't be here, I said, my voice trembling. But the house didn't seem ready to let us leave. That night, sleep was elusive. Every groan of the house felt deliberate, every breeze a whisper. Just past midnight, I awoke to the sound of laughter, low and unsettling. I turned to find Lana standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn.
Did you hear that?
She asked. Before I could respond, Quinn's voice echoed down the hall.
Come here.
We followed the sound, but she wasn't there. The mansion seemed to stretch and shift, hallways elongating and doors appearing where none had been before. The study remained unchanged, except for the candle. Its flame burned brighter than ever, its shadows now forming strange shapes that almost resembled faces. By morning, Quinn discovered an old journal tucked inside a trunk. The brittle pages held the fragmented memories of someone who had lived in the mansion.
Christmas Eve, 1985. The argument got out of hand. I didn't mean for it to happen. The stares, the silence. I can't change what's done. But I can't let anyone know.
The entry ended abruptly, followed by one hastily scrawled line.
The candle won't let me forget.
What does it mean?
Lana asked, her voice barely audible. Quinn looked shaken.
My grandfather. He might have done something terrible. Someone died here, and this candle, it's connected to him, to his guilt.
That evening, we returned to the study with a plan. Quinn brought a new candle, hoping to replace the old one, and recited an apology aloud, asking for peace for the spirit of the person who had been wronged. At first, nothing happened. Then the original candle's flame surged, filling the room with an overwhelming brightness. Shadows writhed on the walls, forming distorted faces, expressions of anguish, anger, and sorrow. The air grew heavy, and a loud, mournful cry filled the room, reverberating through the mansion. Instinctively, we fled, the house groaning as though it were alive. When we reached the driveway, we turned to see the house fall silent, its windows dark and hollow once more. We never spoke of that night again. The mansion still stands, but we've never returned. Every Christmas Eve, I dream of that candle, its flame burning eternally. A quiet yet powerful reminder of a secret that refuses to fade. Some memories are too heavy for time to erase, their echoes lingering in the light of a single, unyielding flame. Every Christmas, my family honored a tradition unlike any I'd ever heard of among my friends. While others went to bustling lots to pick out a fresh pine or retrieved artificial trees from storage, we ventured deep into the woods behind our home to find and cut down our own Christmas tree. It wasn't just about the act of selecting a tree. It was a ritual, a bond with the forest my father revered.
This forest is part of us,
He'd say, the axe resting on his shoulder as we trudged through the snow.
It's been here longer than this house, longer than this town. Our family and these woods, there's a connection you can't find in books or stories.
As a child, those words felt magical. The towering evergreens, heavy with snow, seemed like sentinels guarding an ancient secret. The air smelled of pine and frost, and I imagined the forest offering us the best tree every year, like an unspoken pact. My father would always tell me to listen closely, to let the forest speak and guide us to the perfect one. In those early years, I'd giggle and play along, imagining the whispers of trees choosing us as much as we chose them. But as I grew older, something shifted. The forest no longer felt inviting. It felt watchful. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive it became. The towering trees loomed like silent judges, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to warn us away. By the time I was a teenager, I no longer found the tradition enchanting. I started to notice the way my father's voice dropped to a hushed tone the moment we crossed the tree line, how his eyes scanned the forest as if expecting to see something he never spoke of. "What's so special about these woods?" I asked once, frustrated by the freezing trek one particularly snowy Christmas.
They've always given us what we need,
he said, his voice flat.
But you have to respect them. You don't take what doesn't feel right. You don't take too much.
He never explained further, and I stopped asking, but the unease stayed with me. There was something in his tone, something heavy, unspoken, and fearful. It was December 23rd, and the snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the woods in a stillness so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. My father, as was his custom, insisted we wait until the evening to begin our search for the perfect tree.
The forest speaks loudest at dusk,
he always said, a statement that had become more unsettling to me over the years. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time we set out, casting the sky in muted tones of gray and orange. The cold was biting, and the snow crunched loudly beneath our boots as we trudged through the familiar paths. My father carried the axe over his shoulder, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. At first, the walk felt routine, almost nostalgic. The pines along the edge of the forest were the ones I'd known all my life, their towering shapes a familiar comfort. But as we ventured deeper, the forest began to change. The trees here were taller, their trunks thicker and darker, their branches twisted unnaturally, gnarled like arthritic fingers reaching skyward. The air grew colder, sharper, and the silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. "Why are we going so far this year?" I asked, breaking the quiet. My voice felt intrusive, as though I'd disturbed something sacred.
"The best trees aren't on the paths everyone knows,"
my father replied without turning. We walked for what felt like an hour, deeper into a part of the woods I'd never seen before. The snow seemed untouched here, pristine and undisturbed, as if no one had dared tread this far. Finally, my father stopped abruptly.
"Here,"
he said, gesturing ahead. I followed his gaze to a massive pine standing alone in a small clearing. It was unlike any tree I'd ever seen. Its needles were unnaturally green, almost glowing in the fading light, and its trunk was wide and solid, the bark smooth yet pulsing faintly, as though something moved beneath its surface. "This one looks strange," I said, my voice wavering.
"It's perfect,"
my father replied, already unslinging the axe from his shoulder. He approached the tree with a reverence I didn't understand, running his gloved hand along the bark before taking his first swing. The axe bit into the trunk with a sickening thud, and for a moment the forest came alive. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the clearing. It wasn't the sound of wood splitting, it was something else, something deeper, like a low, guttural cry of protest. I froze, my breath visible in the icy air. "Did you hear that?" I asked.
"It's just the wind,"
my father said, though his hand paused on the axe handle. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He swung again, and the groan came once more, louder this time, reverberating through the trees. The air seemed to thrum with it, and I felt it in my chest, like the beating of a distant drum. With one final swing, the tree began to fall. The sound of it crashing to the ground was deafening, louder than it should have been, and the forest seemed to shudder as though recoiling from the act. My father wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded toward the tree.
"We'll drag it back and decorate it tonight,"
he said, his voice steady but hollow. We lashed the tree to a sled and began the long trek home. The silence of the forest was unbearable, broken only by the scrape of the sled's runners against the snow. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of the firelight, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. "Do you feel that?" I asked finally, my voice low.
Feel what?
My father replied, not looking at me. "Like something's following us." He didn't answer, but his grip on the axe tightened and his pace quickened. By the time we reached the house, I was trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of the forest's silence. As we brought the tree inside and set it up in the living room, I couldn't help but glance back at the woods. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a movement, something large and dark slipping between the trees. Just the wind, I told myself, but the words did little to calm me. Inside, the tree looked majestic, almost too perfect. Its branches stretched wide, its needles gleaming under the dim light of the room. But as we began to decorate it, I noticed something unsettling. The tree's branches didn't feel like wood. They felt warm, almost alive. "Dad," I started to say, but he cut me off.
It's just a tree.
He said firmly, his eyes avoiding mine.
A beautiful tree. Let's finish this and get some rest.
But as I placed the final ornament on one of its branches, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had brought something into our home that didn't belong there, something that wasn't a tree at all. That night, we brought the tree into the house, its sheer size dwarfing the living room. As we settled it into the stand, the weight of its branches seemed to shift unnaturally, almost as if it was adjusting itself. My father muttered about the perfect fit, but I couldn't shake the odd sensation that the tree was doing more than settling. It was claiming its space. The tree looked flawless, almost eerily so. Its deep green needles shimmered under the soft glow of the overhead light, and not a single one fell, even as we handled it. I ran my fingers along the branches, expecting the prickly texture of pine, but instead they felt smooth, unnervingly pliable, and warm to the touch.
Isn't it beautiful?
My father said, stepping back to admire it. I nodded, but the words felt forced. The tree was beautiful, yes, but it was also wrong. Something about it felt too perfect, too precise, like a painting where every stroke was deliberate yet cold. We began decorating. My father handed me boxes of ornaments, and I carefully placed them on the branches. The tree seemed to almost absorb the weight of each decoration, its branches curving slightly as if holding the ornaments in place. The room slowly transformed into a picture-perfect Christmas scene, but as I stepped back to admire our work, the unease returned. The lights wrapped around the tree blinked in steady patterns, but the way their glow reflected off the needles felt unnatural. It was as if the tree wasn't illuminated by the lights, but was radiating light of its own.
Let's finish up,
my father said, his voice cheerful but hurried. I could see it in his face. He felt it too, even if he wouldn't say it out loud. By the time we placed the star on top, it was nearly midnight. My father sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the tree with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You okay?" I asked, sitting across from him. He nodded, but his eyes never left the tree.
Just tired. Go get some rest. Big day tomorrow.
I hesitated, but eventually went upstairs, leaving him alone in the glow of the tree's lights. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint creaking sound. At first, I thought it was the old wooden beams of the house groaning under the weight of the snowstorm outside, but the noise was too rhythmic. It sounded deliberate, like the shifting of heavy wood. Curiosity and unease dragged me from my bed. Wrapping myself in a robe, I crept downstairs, the cold seeping into my bare feet. The creaking grew louder as I approached the living room, each step heightening my dread. When I reached the doorway, I froze. The tree was moving, its branches stretched outward, bending and twisting as though reaching for something unseen. The ornaments swayed lightly, catching the dim light of the room, and the entire tree seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were breathing. I took a step closer, my breath caught in my throat. That's when I saw it. A face, faint but unmistakable, etched into the bark of the trunk. The features were grotesque, twisted in anguish, the hollow eyes staring directly at me. "Dad!" I screamed, stumbling backward. My father burst into the room moments later, his face pale and drawn.
What's wrong?
I pointed at the tree, unable to speak. His eyes followed my trembling hand, and when he saw the face in the bark, his expression turned to one of pure terror. For a moment, we stood frozen, neither of us daring to move. Then the face twisted, its mouth opening in a silent scream that sent shivers down my spine.
Get out of the house,
my father whispered, his voice trembling. What? I asked, my legs rooted to the spot.
Now,
he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. As we fled into the snow, I glanced back at the tree one last time. Its branches were no longer reaching aimlessly. They were clawing at the walls, the ornaments falling and shattering as the tree shifted violently. The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was the face in the bark. Its hollow eyes followed me, and for a brief moment I thought I heard it whisper my name. The snow enveloped us as we fled into the freezing night, each breath visible in the icy air. The wind howled around us, carrying sharp flakes that stung our skin, but it wasn't the cold that made my hands tremble. It was the sound behind us. The house groaned, a deep, unnatural noise that rose above the wailing wind. It wasn't just the creak of old wood or the strain of weather, it was something alive. I glanced back and saw the faint, flickering glow of the lights through the window. Shadows danced on the walls inside, but they weren't still. They moved, twisted, reaching as though the tree itself was shifting within the house. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice raw with fear as I stumbled through the deep snow. My father didn't stop. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, but he pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the dark forest ahead.
It's the forest,
he said, his voice shaking.
It doesn't like when we take too much. I should have known better. That tree, it wasn't ours to take.
I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in my throat. The forest loomed around us now, the tall trees swaying in the wind, their twisted branches blocking out what little moonlight there was. Shadows danced among them, flickering in and out of view like phantoms. And then I heard it. At first it was faint, almost lost in the howling wind, a soft murmur, barely perceptible. But as we pushed deeper into the trees, the sound grew louder, clearer.
"Return it,"
the voices whispered.
"Bring it back."
I froze, my legs refusing to move. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My father stopped, turning to face me. His eyes were wide, his face pale as though the blood had drained from it. He nodded once.
"I hear it,"
he said.
"I've heard it before."
"What do you mean, before?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest.
"This isn't the first time the forest has spoken,"
he admitted, his voice barely audible over the wind.
"But I've never taken a tree like this one. I didn't listen. I should have listened."
The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like the wind itself had come alive. The words were clearer now, overlapping and echoing in the stillness of the night.
"Return it. Bring it back. It doesn't belong to you."
The sound wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, pressing against my thoughts like an unbearable weight. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows thickening, the branches overhead forming a canopy that blotted out the sky. My father grabbed my arm, his grip firm despite the trembling in his hands.
"We need to take it back,"
he said.
"Now, before it's too late."
I didn't argue. Something deep inside me told me he was right. We ran back to the house, the snow crunching loudly beneath our boots. The wind seemed to push against us now, as if the forest itself was trying to stop us from returning. By the time we reached the door, I was out of breath, my chest tight with cold and fear. The moment we stepped inside, I felt it. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive heat that made it hard to breathe. The faint smell of pine from earlier had vanished, replaced by something sharp and metallic like rusted iron. And then I saw it. The tree had grown. Its branches spread out across the walls and ceiling like veins, dark and twisted, their tips ending in sharp, thorn-like points. The ornaments we had placed so carefully were gone, swallowed by the bark, which now pulsed faintly as though alive. The lights we had strung were dim, their glow barely visible beneath the gnarled mass of branches.
God,
my father whispered, his voice breaking. The face in the bark was still there, but it had changed. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth had twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to mock us.
help me.
My father said, snapping me out of my stupor. I nodded, my hands shaking as I moved toward the monstrous tree. Dragging it out of the house was a nightmare. The branches resisted, clawing at the walls and floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The bark was rough and warm to the touch, almost burning my hands as I gripped it. The whispers grew louder, angrier, the voices overlapping in a cacophony that made my head pound.
Return it. Bring it back. You don't belong here.
The tree writhed as we pulled it toward the door, its thorn-like tips lashing out, slicing through fabric and skin alike. Blood dripped onto the floor, but we didn't stop. My father gritted his teeth, his face pale with effort as he heaved the massive trunk forward. With one final pull, we dragged it out into the snow. The moment it hit the ground, the whispers stopped, leaving behind a deafening silence. The tree lay still for a moment, its branches twitching faintly, as though it were alive but too weak to move. The oppressive heat from the house lifted, replaced by the biting cold of the winter night. I looked at my father, his hands bleeding, his breath visible in the frigid air. He nodded toward the forest.
We're not done yet,
he said.
We have to take it back.
I nodded, swallowing hard as I turned to face the dark woods. The forest was waiting. The journey back to the clearing was agonizing, each step weighed down by the biting cold and the overwhelming sense that we weren't alone. The whispers had returned, louder and more persistent than ever, weaving through the wind with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate.
Return it. Return it.
The words echoed around us, overlapping and blending into a symphony of anger and sorrow. The shadows of the trees danced unnaturally, stretching and twisting as though alive. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I could swear the forest had drawn closer, the dark shapes of the towering pines leaning inward to watch us.
We're almost there,
my father said, his voice strained as he pulled the sled carrying the monstrous tree. His hands were bleeding, the makeshift rope cutting into his palms, but he didn't slow down. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the forest seemed to shift with every step. Landmarks that should have been familiar, fallen logs, clusters of smaller trees, were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of snow and shadow. It felt as though we were walking in circles, trapped in a maze the forest had created just for us. Are we lost? I asked, panic creeping into my voice.
No,
my father said quickly, though his eyes darted nervously to the trees around us.
It's trying to confuse us. Just keep moving.
The whispers grew sharper, angrier, and I felt the air around me grow colder. My breath fogged in the icy air, and the weight of the whispers pressed against my thoughts like a physical force. When we finally reached the clearing, my legs nearly gave out in relief. The space where the tree had once stood glowed faintly. The snow melted away to reveal dark, damp earth. The ground seemed to pulse softly, like a heartbeat, and the air was heavy with an unplaceable energy. My father and I moved quickly, heaving the tree into place. Its roots, which had thrashed and twisted during the journey, stilled the moment they touched the earth. Slowly, almost hungrily, they began to sink into the ground, spreading like veins as though they had never been severed. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute, the kind that feels unnatural and wrong. Even the wind had died down, leaving the clearing eerily still. I think it's over, I whispered, my voice shaking as I stared at the tree. It looked normal now, its branches still, its needles dark and glossy. My father didn't respond. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the tree, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Then, the tree's branches shuddered. The motion was subtle at first, a faint tremble that rippled through the needles. But it quickly grew more violent, the branches twisting and contorting as though writhing in pain or fury. A deep, resonant voice filled the clearing, louder and more commanding than the whispers had ever been.
You took what wasn't yours,
it said, its tone heavy with anger.
Now the forest takes something in return.
The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a single voice. It was layered, a cacophony of tones that seemed to vibrate through my bones. My father stepped forward, his face pale and drawn.
It was me.
He said, his voice trembling.
I took it. Take me.
No, I shouted, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off.
This is how it has to be,
he said, his eyes locking with mine.
Go. Don't look back.
Before I could respond, the roots of the tree shot out, moving with a speed and precision that was horrifying. They wrapped around my father's legs, pulling him toward the base of the tree. "Dad!" I screamed, lunging forward, but the roots lashed out, forming a barrier that forced me back. My father didn't struggle. His eyes stayed on me, filled with a mixture of fear and acceptance.
Take care of yourself,
he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the roots dragging him closer to the tree. I watched helplessly as the roots pulled him into the earth, the ground closing over him as though he had never been there. The tree's branches stilled, its twisted form returning to silence. I fell to my knees, the weight of the moment crushing me. The clearing was quiet again, but it wasn't peace I felt. It was the oppressive presence of the forest, watching, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the tree that had taken my father. It felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Eventually, the cold forced me to move. My body ached, my hands raw and bleeding, but I managed to stumble out of the clearing and back into the forest. The whispers didn't follow me this time, but the silence was worse. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath, letting me leave but not forgiving me. When I finally reached the house, it was empty. The tree was gone and the living room was cold and dark. Only the faint smell of pine lingered, a cruel reminder of what had happened. The forest had taken what it wanted, and it wasn't done watching. I never saw my father again. His absence left a hollow in my life, one that no amount of time could fill. When I returned to the house after that harrowing night, it was as though the tree had never been there. The living room was cold and empty, stripped of all traces of the monstrous presence that had haunted it just hours before. Yet the faint smell of pine lingered, a cruel reminder of what had been taken. The days that followed were a blur of silence and solitude. Friends and neighbors came by, offering condolences for my father's disappearance, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. How could I tell them that the forest behind our home had claimed him? That the tree we had brought into our house wasn't just a tree, but something alive, ancient, and vengeful. I tried to move on, but the forest wouldn't let me. It began subtly at first. The woods behind our home, which had once been a source of tradition and comfort, now loomed like a silent, watchful sentinel. The trees seemed darker, their trunks thicker, their branches more twisted. The sunlight that used to filter through the canopy now struggled to pierce the dense shadows. And then there were the whispers. They came on the wind, soft and fleeting, like echoes of voices carried from far away. At first I told myself it was my imagination, a symptom of grief and guilt. But as the weeks turned to months, the whispers grew clearer, their tone both sorrowful and accusatory.
Return what was taken. Keep the balance. Beware the forest's gaze.
I avoided the woods, but I could never escape them. From my bedroom window, I could see the treetops swaying in the wind, their movements almost deliberate, as though they were shifting to follow my gaze. On quiet nights, I'd wake to the sound of creaking wood, like footsteps echoing through the forest floor. And every Christmas, it was the same. The whispers grew louder as December approached, their cadence rising and falling like a chant. The air around the house grew colder, even when the fire roared in the hearth. And then there were the trees. At first I thought it was my imagination. The bark of the pines seemed to shift, forming faint patterns that looked like faces. But as the years passed, those faces became clearer, more defined. Each Christmas, I'd notice a new one, etched into the bark with grotesque precision. One year, I swore I saw my father's face among them. I ran into the house, my heart pounding, but the image stayed with me. His hollow eyes, His lips twisted into a silent plea, stared back at me from the twisted bark. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew the truth. The forest hadn't forgotten him, or me. I've thought about leaving, about selling the house and moving far away. But some part of me knows it wouldn't matter. The forest would follow, its whispers carried on the wind, its shadow stretching across whatever life I tried to build. So I stay. I stay because I owe the forest a debt I can never repay, and because a part of me fears what might happen if I left. The woods behind my home are darker now, their presence heavier with each passing year. The faces in the bark are my constant companions, their watchful eyes a reminder of the price we paid for one foolish mistake. And every Christmas, when the wind blows just right, I hear the whispers again. They call to me, soft but insistent, beckoning me back to the clearing where it all began. I don't go, but I know someday I might have to, because the forest doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please hit follow to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon, and goodbye.